The water of the Great Glen is too deep for light, too cold for comfort, and too ancient for our modern understanding of biology. For nearly a century, we have looked into the peat-stained depths of Loch Ness, searching for a ghost of the Jurassic, a physical relic of a lost world. But we have been looking for the wrong kind of monster. What if the creature that ripples the surface isn't a survivor of an extinction event, but a byproduct of an invocation? On the southeastern shore of the loch stands Boleskine House, a manor with a foundation built on fire and a reputation built on blood. It was here, at the turn of the 20th century, that Aleister Crowley, the man the press would eventually brand the wickedest man in the world, attempted to tear open the veil between our reality and the abyss. He sought the conversation of an angel, but he invited the hunger of the demonic. He began a ritual that required absolute isolation and the binding of the kings of hell, only to walk away before the circle was closed. This is the story of the Boleskine Rupture. It is a chronicle of an unclosed gate, a mage's unchecked ambition, and the accidental creation of a legend that has haunted the collective psyche for generations. To understand the shadow that hangs over the Highlands, we must first look at the water not as a body of liquid, but as a conductor of history. The Great Glen is a massive geological fault, a tear in the fabric of the earth that stretches from coast to coast. It is a place where the geography itself feels unfinished. For over 1,000 years, the locals have known that something dwells within that tear. They called it the Kelpie, they called it the H-Whisker, they called it a warning. The first written record of this presence does not come from a scientist or a skeptic, but from a saint. In the year 565 AD, the Irish missionary Saint Columba was traveling through the territory of the Picts, carrying the light of a new religion into a land of mist and standing stones. According to his biographer Adam Nunn, Columba reached the banks of the River Ness and found a group of locals burying a man who had been mauled to death while swimming. The villagers spoke of a water beast, a creature of savage intent that claimed the river as its own. Columba, seeking to demonstrate the authority of his god over the old terrors of the landscape, ordered one of his followers, Luin Mokhu Min, to swim across the water and fetch a boat. As the man entered the current, the beast surfaced. It did not merely swim, it rose with a roar that felt like the shaking of the earth. As the creature lunged for the swimmer, Columba raised his hand, made the sign of the cross, and commanded the beast to go no further. The chronicle says the creature fled as if it were being pulled back by invisible ropes. This account is the foundational lore of the region. It establishes the presence of a malevolent force, one that was traditionally understood through the lens of spiritual warfare. For centuries after, the loch remained a place of quiet dread. The Highlanders knew the water was deep, reaching down nearly 800 feet into a darkness where no light could ever penetrate. They knew that the bodies of the drowned rarely surfaced, held fast by the cold and the pressure. But the modern obsession with this presence would take a decidedly darker turn with the arrival of a man who styled himself as the very antithesis of Saint Columba. Aleister Crowley was born Edward Alexander Crowley in 1875, a child of immense intellect and even greater inheritance. Raised in the suffocating strictures of the Plymouth Brethren, he spent his youth learning the Bible by heart, only to identify with its villains. To Crowley, The dragon and the beast were not symbols of evil to be feared, but archetypes of power to be harnessed. By the time he reached the age of 23, he had abandoned his name and his family's faith, seeking instead the hidden mechanisms of the universe. His journey led him to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society of occultists in London who believed that the ancient traditions of magic could be revitalized through rigorous study and ritual performance. Crowley was a prodigy of the dark arts. He moved through the grades of the order with a speed that unsettled his peers. He was a man who hungered for the forbidden, a man who believed that the only way to reach the heights of spiritual evolution was to first descend into the depths of the psyche. But Crowley soon found the drawing room magic of the London elite to be insufficient. He required a trial of fire. He sought a specific and grueling 18-month operation known as the Abramelin ritual. This operation, sourced from a 15th century grimoire, was designed to bring the practitioner into contact with their holy guardian angel. But the cost was immense. It required months of total seclusion, the purification of the body, and the eventual summoning and binding of the 12 kings and dukes of hell. To perform such a task, Crowley needed more than just a room. He needed a vessel. He required a location that was physically isolated but psychically conductive, a place where the veil between the worlds was already frayed. His search for the perfect conditions for a spiritual retreat led him away from the city and into the rugged, desolate beauty of the Scottish Highlands. He was drawn to the southeastern shore of Loch Ness, to a manor known as Boleskine House. Boleskine was not merely a residence, it was a site of historical trauma. The house, built in the 1760s, stood on the ruins of a 13th century church that had burned to the ground with the entire congregation trapped inside. The earth beneath the floorboards was literally seasoned with the ash of the dead. It was a place where the local folklore spoke of minister Thomas Houston, who had once been forced to lay animated corpses back into their graves after a wizard had raised them in the nearby Boleskine cemetery. For an occultist like Crowley, this history of sudden, violent death was an asset. It meant the barrier between the living and the dead was already thin. In 1899, he purchased the estate and immediately set about transforming it into an oratory of the dark arts. He arrived not as a mystic, but under the guise of Lord Boleskine, a country gentleman who spent his days hunting and his nights in the library. But the locals noticed the change in the air. They noticed the silence that seemed to settle over the manor, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Inside the house, Crowley was partitioning the space according to the exact architectural demands of the Abramelin grimoire. He constructed a terrace covered in fine river sand and installed large mirrors to amplify the astral forms he intended to call forth. He was preparing to turn Boleskine into a lighthouse for the spirits. He began the months of prayer and abstinence, shutting himself away from the world and turning his focus entirely inward. But as Crowley began the preliminary invocations, the loch itself seemed to respond. Those early months of the ritual were marked by a shift in the local atmosphere. The weather became unpredictable, even by Highland standards. The water of the loch, usually a slate grey, began to churn in patterns that defied the wind. It was as if the intense psychic pressure Crowley was building within the walls of Boleskine was leaking out, bleeding into the landscape. Crowley described his work as an attempt to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. He believed that by confronting the demons of the infernal hierarchy, he could strip away the illusions of the ego and stand before the light of his higher self. But there was a fundamental arrogance in his approach. He was attempting to command forces that had no interest in being bound by a human will. He was creating a vacuum, and something in the water was beginning to notice the void. We see the first hints of the loom beginning to weave. On one thread, we have the ancient beast of St. Columba, a creature of the elements that had been dormant for a millennium. On the second thread, we have a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of the forbidden, opening a door that he did not fully understand. And on the third thread, we have Boleskine House itself, a haunted hearth that served as the anchor point for this convergence. Crowley's arrival was the catalyst. He did not come to Loch Ness to find a monster. He came to find himself. But in the process of his rituals, he was effectively broadcasting a signal into the deep. The Abramelin operation required the magician to inhabit a state of shut-in existence, a mental and physical pressure cooker that heightened the senses and thinned the blood. As he paced the sand-covered terrace of Boleskine, Crowley was not just reciting ancient Hebrew and Greek, he was vibrating the very air around the loch. The locals began to whisper about the great beast of Boleskine, though they were referring to the man, not a creature in the water. Yet the distinction was becoming increasingly blurred. Crowley's presence was a disturbance in the field. He was a rupture in the quiet continuity of the Highlands. And while he sat in his oratory, surrounded by the scent of consecrated oils and the flicker of candlelight, he was unaware that his spiritual retreat was becoming an invitation. There were distractions even in the beginning. The ritual demanded a purity of purpose that Crowley struggled to maintain. He was a man of intense appetites, and the isolation began to wear on his psyche. He reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision, forms that did not belong to the ritual but seemed to be drawn to the energy of it. He dismissed them as astral debris, the byproduct of a thinning veil. But this debris was gathering, it was coalescing. As Crowley worked to summon the kings of hell, he was inadvertently providing a blueprint for something to manifest. He was creating a ThoughtForm, an echo of his own ambition and the local dread, and he was feeding it with the intensity of his focus. The water beast of St. Columba was no longer a story from a dusty hagiography. It was becoming a necessity. The stage was set, the house was prepared. The magician was in his circle. But as the first 6 months of the operation drew to a close, Crowley began to realize that the forces he was inviting into Boleskine were more volatile than he had anticipated. The ritual was not just a conversation, it was a combat. And as he looked out across the misty expanse of Loch Ness from his bow window, he could feel that the water was no longer just water. It was a mirror, and something in the deep was finally starting to look back. The world did not know it was waiting for a monster until the spring of 1933. Before that year, the mysteries of Loch Ness were the private property of the locals. Tales told over peat fires to explain the unexplainable disappearances of livestock or the strange rhythmic thumping of the water against the shore on windless nights. But on May 2nd, the Inverness Courier published a report that would act as a lightning rod for the global imagination. A local couple, Aldi and John Mackay, had been driving along the newly constructed road on the northern shore when they witnessed something that shattered their understanding of the natural world. They described an enormous animal rolling and plunging in the center of the loch, its back breaking the surface like the hull of a capsized ship. The water, they said, was cascading and churning like a simmering cauldron. The report, penned by water bailiff Alex Campbell, was the first to use the word monster to describe the phenomenon. It was a word that stuck because it provided a shape for the dread that had been simmering in the Highlands for decades. The Mackay's sighting was not an isolated event, but a beginning. It was as if a curtain had been pulled back, revealing a stage that had been set long ago. The geographical center of this emerging drama was not the open water where the Mackays had looked, but the land directly opposite them on the southeastern shore. It was the site of Boleskine House, the very manor where Aleister Crowley had performed his incomplete orisons 33 years prior. To the casual observer, the timing seemed coincidental. To the student of the occult, the timing was a fulfillment of a debt. The Mackays saw the water boiling, but they did not see the fire that had started it. Boleskine House was never intended to be a place of peace. Built in the 1760s by Colonel Archibald Fraser, it was a hunting lodge designed for the elite to observe the slaughter of the local deer. But the ground it sat upon was already thick with the memory of agony. The local legend, whispered by the families who had lived in the glen for generations, told of a 13th century church that once occupied the site. During a Sunday service, a fire broke out, a sudden, unnatural inferno that trapped the entire congregation inside. The screams of the dying were said to have soaked into the very peat of the hillside, creating a permanent stain of psychic distress. This was the foundation upon which Boleskine was built. It was a house constructed over a mass grave, a residence where the living were always outnumbered by the ghosts of the incinerated. This history of sudden, violent death is a recurring motif at Boleskine, a dark thread that runs through every era of its existence. Even before the great beast arrived, the area was associated with Minister Thomas Houston, a man of God who found himself performing duties far outside the realm of the ecclesiastical. Local lore claims that a wizard in the adjoining Boleskine cemetery had attempted to raise the dead, and Houston was called upon to literally lay the animated corpses back into their graves, using the power of prayer to force the rotting remains to stay beneath the soil. The veil at Boleskine was not just thin, it was shredded. It was a place where the dead did not rest, and the living did not feel alone. When Aleister Crowley purchased the house in 1899, he was not looking for a scenic retreat or a quiet place to write. He was a hunter of a different kind, and he knew that Boleskine was the perfect blind. For an occultist of his caliber, a history of tragedy was not a deterrent, but a primary requirement. He understood that certain locations act as psychic conductors, places where the electromagnetic and the ethereal interact with greater intensity. He described the house as a long, low building that felt as though it were crouched against the hillside, hiding something. He immediately set about partitioning the southwestern half of the manor to create his oratory, a sacred space where he could perform the Abramelin operation without interruption. Crowley's choice of Boleskine was a strategic deployment of spiritual geography. The Abramelin ritual required the magician to inhabit a space that could be completely sealed from the mundane world, while remaining open to the celestial and the infernal. He modified the architecture of the house to meet the rigorous demands of the 15th century grimoire. He built a door that opened toward the north, the quarter of the compass associated with the greatest spiritual density and the manifestation of entities. Outside this door, he constructed a terrace and covered it in fine river sand. This sand was not for decoration. It was a medium. In the tradition of ceremonial magic, spirits are often invited to manifest in a way that leaves physical traces, and the sand of the Boleskine terrace was meant to act as a witness to the footsteps of things that do not have feet. Inside the oratory, Crowley installed large mirrors, placing them in positions that would reflect and amplify the astral forms he intended to call forth. To Crowley, these mirrors were not glass and silver, they were portals. He believed that the human eye could be trained to see into the depths of the reflection, where the vibration of the spirit world becomes visible to the initiate. He was turning Boleskine into a hall of echoes, a place where every thought, every invocation, and every desire was reflected back with increasing force. He was preparing to invite the 12 kings and dukes of hell into his home, and he wanted to make sure they had plenty of room to manifest. But as Crowley began the long months of isolation, he found that the house itself was already speaking. He reported that the shadows in the hallways seemed to move independently of the light. He described a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that made it difficult to breathe, as if the air itself were becoming thick with the presence of unseen guests. The sinister history of the site was providing the raw material for his work. The ghosts of the burnt congregation, the animated corpses of the cemetery, and the blood of the hunted deer were all being drawn into the vacuum he was creating. He was not just performing a ritual, he was feeding a furnace. The locals avoided the manor. They spoke of a black magic being practiced on the hillside, and they noticed that the animals in the area seemed to share their unease. Dogs would refuse to pass the gates of Boleskine, and the birds would fall silent as they flew over the roofline. The pressure was building, not just within the walls of the house, but in the environment surrounding it. The loch, lying just at the foot of the hill, acted as a massive battery, absorbing the psychic discharge of Crowley's operations. Water is a natural storehouse for memory and energy, and the deep, dark basin of Loch Ness was beginning to fill with the residue of Crowley's ambition. By the time Crowley reached the 6-month mark of the ritual, the environment at Boleskine had become truly aberrant. He was maintaining a state of total celibacy and abstinence, focusing his vital energy into a single, sharp point of intent. He was calling to his holy guardian angel, but the response he was receiving was far more chaotic. He began to hear scratching at the doors, not the scratching of a dog, but the rhythmic, persistent clawing of something trying to get in. He saw shapes in the mist that rose from the loch, forms that looked like long, undulating necks or humped backs, disappearing the moment he tried to fix his gaze upon them. He dismissed these as hallucinations brought on by the rigor of the ritual, but the physical world began to provide evidence that something was indeed wrong. His housekeeper's husband, a man known for his sobriety and quiet demeanor, suddenly fell into a state of violent, uncontrollable drunkenness. He became convinced that invisible demons were mocking him, and in a fit of terror and rage, he attempted to murder his wife and children. Crowley had to intervene, using his magical authority to calm the man, but the damage was done. The ritual was leaking. The protection that the circle was supposed to provide was failing, and the infernal forces Crowley had invited were beginning to find outlets in the people around him. Then came the tragedy of the lodge keeper, Hugh Gillies. Within a year of Crowley's arrival and the commencement of the deeper invocations, Gillies suffered the sudden, inexplicable deaths of 2 of his children. A 10-year-old daughter and a 15-month-old son were taken by a sickness that the local doctors could not name. To the villagers, it was the curse of Boleskine. To Crowley, it was a distraction, a sign that the spirits were becoming restless and were seeking sacrifices that he had not authorized. He noted these events in his diary with a chilling detachment, as if the deaths of children were merely data points in a grand experiment. The most bizarre incident involved a local butcher who came to the manor to fill an order. Crowley had written the list of supplies on the back of a piece of parchment that had been used during a preliminary invocation of the spirits. As the butcher was preparing the meat, he reportedly felt a sudden cold wind brush past him. His hand slipped, and he accidentally chopped off all the fingers of his right hand. The parchment, soaked in the man's blood, was later found in the gutter of the market. Crowley's work was no longer confined to the oratory. It was bleeding into the commerce, the families, and the very bodies of the people of the glen. Crowley was creating a psychic rupture, a tear in the fabric of the local reality that allowed the impossible to become probable. He was convinced that he was the master of these forces, that he could navigate the abyss and return unscathed. But he was forgetting the nature of the abyss. He was forgetting that when you open a door to the kings of hell, you are not just inviting them in, you are giving them a reason to stay. He was building a home for something that did not belong in the Highlands, a creature of thought and intent that was beginning to find its density in the cold, dark water of the loch. The house on the hill and the water in the glen were becoming a single, unified system of high strangeness. The fire of the 13th century and the ritual of the 20th century were converging. As the spring of 1933 approached, decades after Crowley had left the house, the pressure that had been building finally reached its breaking point. The Mackayes saw a monster rolling in the water, but what they were actually witnessing was the first physical crystallization of the shadow Crowley had left behind. The simmering cauldron of the loch was finally boiling over. The legend of Nessie was born from this intersection of trauma and ritual. It was not a discovery of a new species, but a recognition of a persistent haunting. The Mackayes gave the shadow a name, but Crowley had given it a soul. And as the world began to flock to the shores of the loch with cameras and binoculars, They were unaware that they were stepping into a ritual that was still in progress. The haunted hearth of Boleskine was no longer just a house. It was the epicenter of a new mythology, a place where the fire never truly went out and the gate never truly closed. While the world in 1933 was fixated on the simmering cauldron of the open water, a significant land sighting on July 22nd of that year shifted the public's understanding of the monster's nature from a mere lake dweller to something far more invasive. George Spicer and his wife were driving along the loch's northern shore near the village of Dorris when a massive, long-necked animal lurched across the road directly in front of their car. Spicer described a creature 25 feet long with a wavy neck that moved like a scenic railway, carrying a smaller animal, likely a lamb or a sheep, in its mouth. The creature vanished into the thick undergrowth of the hillside, heading toward the water. This account was terrifying, not because of what was submerged, but because of what was moving through the woods. It suggested an amphibious predator that could haunt the land as easily as the deep, a creature that did not respect the boundary between the elements. The Spicer sighting mirrors the intensity and the boundary-blurring nature of the magic Crowley was attempting at Boleskine decades earlier. The Abramelin operation, sourced from the Book of Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, is not a simple spell. It is a rigorous, months-long system of spiritual alchemy designed to bring the practitioner into contact with their holy guardian angel. This contact is considered the central and essential work of the magician, providing divine guidance and the ultimate power to command lower spirits. Names such as Lucifer, Belial, and Satan were not metaphors or literary symbols to Crowley. They were actual, autonomous forces of the collective shadow that had to be raised within his own mental sphere to negate their negative influence on his spiritual evolution. He was inviting the very hierarchy of the pit to stand on his doorstep on the shores of Loch Ness. However, the very forces he was summoning were notorious for their volatility and their tendency to leak into the physical world, if not properly contained. The protection offered by the ritual was only effective if the operation was completed in its entirety, with every spirit bound and every gate closed. Crowley was attempting to map the inner landscape of the human mind by projecting it onto the outer landscape of the Highlands. He was turning his own psyche inside out, and the river sand on his terrace was the first place where his inner demons were given permission to take on a physical weight. As Crowley deepened his invocations, the lodge at the end of the terrace became a center of high strangeness activity. He reported that the mirrors in his oratory would often cloud over with a grey, unnatural mist, even on clear days. He described the sound of heavy footsteps on the sand when no one was there, and the feeling of being watched by eyes that did not belong to any living thing. He was creating a ThoughtForm, a tulpa in the Tibetan tradition, or an egregore in the Western tradition. By focusing his immense will and the trauma of the Boleskine site into a single point, he was inadvertently providing a psychic blueprint for a creature to manifest. He was building a monster out of his own repressed desires and the ancient lore of the Kelpie, feeding it with the vital energy he was supposed to be using for his spiritual ascent. The scenic railway movement of the creature Spicer saw, that undulating, unnatural motion, parallels the way Crowley described the movement of the spirits he evoked. They did not move like animals. They moved like ideas, phasing in and out of density. The sheep seen in the creature's mouth also finds a chilling echo in the local rumors of Crowley's own activities. It was whispered in the villages that Crowley threw a sacrificial sheep into the loch every Sunday as an offering for his pet monster. Whether this was literal or a psychic projection of the locals' fear, it suggests that the energy source for the creature was already being established in the early 1900s. Crowley's ritual sacrifices, whether animal or purely energetic, were the fuel that allowed a ThoughtForm to gain enough mass to eventually be seen by a terrified couple on a Highland road. The Spicer sighting was the moment the world realized that the monster was not down there in the water, but out here in the world. It was a creature that could cross the road, move through the trees and snatch a lamb from a flock. It was a violation of the natural order, much like the ritual Crowley was performing. The Abramelin operation is a violation of the boundary between the human and the divine, a forced entry into the celestial courts. And just as the Spicers were left traumatized by their encounter with the impossible, Crowley was beginning to realize that his guests on the sand-covered terrace were not as subservient as he had hoped. The 12 kings were not just standing on the sand, they were beginning to walk into the woods. The core of the mystery lies in the realization that the Spicer sighting and the Crowley ritual are the same event, separated only by the illusion of time. The creature lurching across the road was the physical echo of the spirits lurching across Crowley's terrace. The wavy neck and the clumsy, wrong movement of the animal were the results of an entity trying to inhabit a physical form that it did not fully understand how to pilot. It was a hybrid of the material and the astral, a creature of sand and shadow that had finally found its way out of the oratory and into the public eye. Crowley's shut-in period at Boleskine was reaching its zenith. He was exhausted, his nerves were frayed, and the protection of his magical circle was being tested by the very entities he had invited. He had created a vacuum of such power that the local environment was being warped to fill it. The water beast of the 6th century was being pulled forward in time, given a new, more modern form by the intensity of Crowley's ritual. The Spicer sighting was the first leak of the 1930s, a sign that the door Crowley had opened was not only still ajar, but that the hinges were starting to fail entirely. The monster was no longer a secret kept by the great beast. It was becoming a permanent resident of the Great Glen. In the early hours of January 5th, 1934, the legend of the Loch took on a new, more clinical dimension. A veterinary student named Arthur Grant was motorcycling through the darkness near Abriachan when his headlight caught a shape that should not have existed. Grant nearly collided with a creature that he described as 15 to 20 feet long, possessing a small head, an elongated neck, and large oval-shaped flippers. Because of his training in anatomy, Grant's account was uniquely detailed. He noted the creature's hybrid appearance, describing it as something between a prehistoric plesiosaur and a modern seal. He watched as the beast made 2 great, clumsy bounds across the road and plunged into the safety of the water. Grant's testimony provided a layer of scientific credibility that the sensationalist news reports lacked, yet it also reinforced a chilling reality. There was a physical entity in the Highlands that was fundamentally out of place in the modern world. The clumsiness and the anatomically jarring nature of the creature Grant witnessed find their explanation not in biology, but in the catastrophic conclusion of the events at Boleskine House. In the late spring of 1900, at the height of the Abramelin operation, the great beast found himself interrupted. While the 12 kings and dukes of hell were being evoked, and the psychic pressure within the house was at its maximum, Crowley received an urgent summons to Paris. Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, the leader of the Golden Dawn, was facing a rebellion within the order and demanded Crowley's immediate presence to help crush the schism. Faced with a choice between completing his spiritual evolution and engaging in a power struggle for the leadership of a secret society, Crowley's ego won. He abandoned Boleskine House with the ritual unfinished. In the tradition of Western ceremonial magic, this is the ultimate transgression. To evoke entities of the infernal hierarchy and then leave the circle without performing the formal license to depart is to leave a door standing wide open. Crowley had invited the kings of hell into the material plane and then walked away, leaving them unbanished, unguided, and unbound. He created a psychic rupture, a permanent gate through which the inhabitants of the abyss could flow into our world at will. The spirits Crowley had summoned were not minor poltergeists. They were the architects of the collective shadow. By leaving without dispelling them, Crowley effectively turned Boleskine and the surrounding waters into a persistent haunt for these forces. Occult theory suggests that spirits left in such a state do not simply vanish. They linger, frustrated and distorted, seeking a form through which they can interact with the material world. They began to manifest in the local environment, drawing upon the ancient folklore of the Kelpie and the collective fears of the villagers to give themselves shape. The monster, witnessed by Arthur Grant, was not a remnant of the Mesozoic, but the first physical crystallization of this lingering ritual residue. It moved clumsily because it was a thought form trying to wear the skin of a predator, a hybrid born of a broken ritual and an open gate. Public fascination reached a fever pitch on April 21, 1934, with the publication of what would become the most famous photograph in history, the surgeon's photograph. Attributed to Robert Kenneth Wilson, the image displayed the iconic silhouette of a long-necked creature rising from the ripples of the loch. For 60 years, this single frame was the primary evidence for the monster's existence, until a deathbed confession in 1994 revealed the truth. The photo was a hoax, a toy submarine outfitted with a sculpted head, orchestrated by a man seeking revenge against the Daily Mail. This revelation highlighted a critical psychological factor that researchers call the will to believe. It proved that the world was so hungry for the mystery of the loch that it would accept a plastic toy as proof of a prehistoric god. However, while the world was debating the hoax of the water, a very real and documented curse was radiating from Boleskine House. The immediate aftermath of Crowley's abandoned ritual was marked by a series of inexplicable tragedies that suggest the open gate was not just a metaphor. Crowley himself eventually conceded that his experiments at Boleskine had gotten out of hand, admitting that the forces he had raised were behaving with a malevolence he couldn't control. Even after he sold the house in 1913, the darkness persisted, as if the manor had developed a memory of its own. Subsequent owners and visitors reported an overwhelming sense of pure evil within the walls, a presence that could not be explained away by the house's drafty architecture. In 1965, the tragedy reached a new peak when a later owner, Major Edward Grant, committed suicide by shooting himself in the very bedroom Crowley had used as his oratory. His housekeeper, Anna McLaren, claimed to have heard the shot as a premonition exactly 7 days before it actually occurred. This suggests that time and causality were becoming warped within the house's influence. The Boleskine Rupture was not just letting in monsters, it was breaking the laws of physics, creating a localized reality where the past, the future, and the impossible were all happening at once. The surgeon's photograph may have been a fake, but the shadow it cast was real. The image became a psychic anchor, a point of focus for millions of people around the globe. This collective focus is the final ingredient in the creation of an egregore. By looking at the loch and expecting to see a monster, the public was unwittingly feeding the open gate Crowley had left behind. They were providing the vital energy needed for the unbanished spirits to continue their manifestations. The hoax didn't disprove the monster. It provided the blueprint for its survival. In the silence of the Great Glen, the wickedest man in the world had left a vacancy, and a global audience was more than happy to fill it with their own nightmares. As the search for the monster moved into the late 20th century, the tools of the hunt shifted from the grainy film of the witness to the cold, analytical pulse of technology. In 1987, a massive endeavor known as Operation Deep Scan deployed a fleet of 24 boats equipped with advanced sonar to sweep the entire length of the loch. While the mission failed to find a definitive biological beast, it recorded 3 unexplained sonar targets that were larger and more powerful than any known fish in these waters. These targets did not behave like schools of salmon or stray seals. They appeared and vanished with a frequency that suggested they were phasing in and out of the material plane. This technological frustration mirrored the controversial flipper and gargoyle head photos of the 1970s, images that hinted at a presence that was elusive, shifting, and perhaps fundamentally non-physical. This era of scientific inquiry was shadowed by a resurgence of interest in the occult history of the Loch, led most notably by Jimmy Page, the legendary guitarist of Led Zeppelin. Page, a dedicated collector of Crowleyana, purchased Boleskine House in 1971. He did not buy it as a vacation home, but as a place of pilgrimage. He sought inspiration for his music and a deeper connection to Crowley's philosophy of thelema. Page believed that the house was a charged location, a battery for the creative and the destructive. Despite his obsession, Page spent remarkably little time at the house, eventually leaving it to the care of his friend Malcolm Dent. Dent, a man of practical mind, soon found that Boleskine refused to be tamed. He reported that the house was active with what he described as bad vibes, a weight in the air that felt like a physical pressure. He witnessed rugs rolling themselves up across the floor, furniture moving in locked rooms, and most chillingly, the sound of a wild animal snorting and clawing at his bedroom door in the dead of night. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty, but the scent of something ancient and wet hung in the air. The unclosed gate Crowley had left behind was not just a historical footnote, it was a living, breathing reality that was now feeding on the fame and the focus of the world's biggest rock star. The Led Zeppelin curse is often cited by fans and biographers as a direct consequence of Page's attempt to harness the energy of Boleskine. After Page reportedly asked his bandmates to participate in rituals designed to ensure their success, a string of inexplicable disasters followed. Robert Plant nearly died in a catastrophic car crash in Greece. His young son, Karak, died suddenly of a mysterious stomach virus. Finally, the death of drummer John Bonham in 1980 effectively ended the band at the height of their power. These tragedies reinforce the idea that the energy of Boleskine is not a tool to be used, but a Midas curse that corrupts everything it touches. The house on the shore was still broadcasting its signal, and anyone who tuned into it found themselves pulled into its destructive resonance. The final piece of the puzzle lies in the ancient occult concepts of the egregore and the tulpa. In Tibetan mysticism, a tulpa is a materialized being or thought form created through intense concentration and spiritual discipline. Western occultists expanded this idea to suggest that a thought form could become autonomous once it was endowed with enough vitality to live apart from its creator. An egregore is a similar phenomenon, but on a global scale, a group mind creation sustained by the shared belief and emotion of millions. It is a creature made of focus, a beast born of expectation. Frederick William Ted Holliday, one of the most dedicated Loch Ness investigators of the 20th century, was the first to propose that the monster might be a supernatural entity rather than a biological one. After decades of watching the water and witnessing the self-concealing nature of the creature, Holliday postulated that Nessie was the direct aftermath of Crowley's preternatural failure. He argued that Crowley's unfinished ritual created the initial psychic blueprint, the tulpa, which was subsequently fed by the collective fear and fascination of the world, transforming it into a powerful egregore that manifests physically in the loch. This theory is supported by the eerie synchronicity of local folklore. Before the monster craze of 1933, the loch was already the home of the Kelpie, a shape-shifting water spirit. The rumors that Crowley threw a sacrificial sheep into the water every Sunday take on a chilling significance when compared to the Spicer sighting of a monster with an animal in its mouth. It suggests that Crowley's ritual sacrifices were the initial energy source that allowed a thought form to gain density. The creature Spicer saw and the hybrid Grant witnessed were not animals evolving in the deep, but ideas gaining mass. They were the physical manifestations of Crowley's unfinished prayer, given form by the fact that the world refused to let the mystery die. This account of the Highlands is not a tale of prehistoric survivors or simple hoaxes. It is a study in the terrifying power of the human psyche to warp its own environment. While modern science dismisses the creature as a biological impossibility, it fails to account for the paranormal data points that have plagued the loch for centuries. The lack of skeletal remains, the absence of DNA evidence for a large reptile, and the persistent sonar anomalies all point toward a single, startling conclusion. The monster of Loch Ness is non-biological because it is non-material. It is a haunting of the water itself. Ultimately, we must realize that the monster is a mirror. It is the atavistic reflection of Aleister Crowley's unchecked ambition, the collective shadow of a world that craves the impossible, and the physical manifestation of the idea that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The fires of 2015 and 2019, which left Boleskine House a hollowed-out ruin, may have been the land's final attempt to cauterize the wound. Yet, the persistent efforts to restore the manor suggest that the great beast's legacy is far from extinguished. The gate is still there, beneath the floorboards and across the water. The creature that lurches across the road or rolls in the deep is not a relic of the past, but a pioneer of a different state of reality. One that Crowley first attempted to map in his oratory on the shores of the loch. In the silence between the sonar pings and the ripples of the water, the ritual is still in progress. Nessie is not a dinosaur. She is the answer to an unbanished invocation. As long as we look into the water and expect to see a monster, she will continue to exist, because we are the ones keeping the gate open. The wickedest man in the world may be gone, but his creation remains, waiting for the next generation to look into the deep and see their own reflection looking back.